The body lay exposed beneath trembling candlelight, its pale skin reflecting a dull sheen that no amount of oil or incense could disguise. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. Thick stone walls trapped the cold, and the faint echoes of footsteps from distant corridors faded into an uneasy silence. This was Florence in 1763, an age of enlightenment on paper, but an age of fear and uncertainty in practice. Death was familiar here, routine even, yet something about this moment felt profoundly wrong. What should have been a brief, methodical examination had already stretched beyond its natural conclusion, and no one in the room could explain why they had not yet stopped. Autopsies were not rare in this era, but they were never casual. Each one was an act of quiet rebellion against centuries of religious doctrine, carried out only under strict conditions and often behind closed doors. The human body was sacred even after death, and to cut into it was to trespass on territory many believed belonged solely to God. Physicians understood this risk, and that was why dissections were meant to be efficient. Observe, document, conclude, and close the body before decay erased the evidence or moral doubt crept in. But on this table, efficiency had failed. Time itself seemed unwilling to move forward. At first, the physicians believed they were facing nothing more than an unusual case, an illness poorly understood, a set of organs that did not align neatly with what medical texts described. Such discrepancies were frustrating but not unheard of. The human body was still a mystery in many ways, and Enlightenment medicine was built as much on educated guesswork as on observation. Yet as the examination continued, small inconsistencies began to accumulate. Certain tissues appeared less degraded than expected. Internal structures suggested processes that should have ceased hours earlier. Nothing was dramatic enough to provoke panic, but everything was wrong enough to provoke doubt. Doubt, in this room, was dangerous. In the 18th century, death was not a single, universally agreed upon moment. There were no machines to declare its arrival with certainty. Physicians relied on breath, pulse, temperature, and the absence of response. They relied on stillness. But history had already taught them that stillness could lie. Across Europe, stories circulated of people pronounced dead only to awaken inside coffins, their final moments marked by scratch marks on wood and twisted expressions frozen in terror. Some of these stories were exaggerated, others documented with chilling clarity. Every anatomist in Florence knew them. Every anatomist feared becoming responsible for one. As the autopsy progressed, the room grew heavier. Assistants whispered instead of speaking. Instruments were handled with exaggerated care, as though the body itself might protest further intrusion. Notes were taken, then rewritten. Measurements were double-checked, then quietly questioned. The physicians were no longer just studying a corpse, they were confronting the fragile assumptions upon which their profession rested. If they were wrong, if death had been declared prematurely, then the very act of dissection transformed from scientific inquiry into something far more disturbing. Florence was a city built on legacy. The achievements of its past loomed over every intellectual pursuit, creating pressure to advance knowledge without dictionarying tradition. The Church tolerated anatomy only so long as it did not openly challenge theological authority. To suggest that death could not be clearly identified was to undermine religious certainty, legal systems, and social order all at once. A prolonged autopsy was not merely a medical curiosity, it was a potential scandal. And yet, stopping was no longer an option. Each attempt to conclude the examination raised more questions than it answered. Observations contradicted one another. Early conclusions no longer seemed reliable. The physicians found themselves returning to previously examined organs, reassessing features they had already documented, as though hoping repetition would restore certainty. Instead, it only deepened the unease. Time passed in an unsettling blur. Days merged into one another. The body remained under observation far longer than protocol allowed, its presence becoming a silent accusation against everyone involved. Outside the walls of the institution, life in Florence continued as normal. Markets opened. Bells rang. Prayers were spoken for the dead. But inside this room, death itself had become ambiguous. The corpse did not rise, did not move, did not perform any of the theatrics that folklore associated with the undead. The horror here was subtler. It was the possibility that death was not instantaneous, that it faded in stages, that somewhere between breath and decay existed a grey territory medicine did not yet understand. This realization unsettled the physicians more than any superstition could have. Science thrived on boundaries, definitions that could be tested, repeated, and trusted. But this body existed in defiance of clear definition. The longer the autopsy continued, the more apparent it became that no authoritative conclusion could be reached without risking professional ruin or moral condemnation. To declare the subject unquestionably dead might later prove false. To admit uncertainty would invite scrutiny from religious authorities and civic leaders alike. So the case became quiet. Documentation continued, but cautiously. Language shifted from confident statements to vague descriptions. Pages that should have contained final conclusions instead hinted at anomalies and unresolved observations. Some notes were removed altogether, their absence as telling as any surviving record. What remained was not a clear medical account, but a trail of hesitation preserved in ink. This was not how science was meant to operate, yet it was how science often survived. The autopsy did not refuse to end because of a single shocking discovery. It refused to end because it forced its observers to confront an unbearable truth, that their understanding of death was incomplete, and that their authority rested on assumptions they could not fully defend. In a world that demanded certainty, from doctors, from priests, from institutions, ambiguity was a threat. What happened to the body after the examination is unclear. Records grow thin, then disappear entirely. Whether it was finally laid to rest, quietly buried, or subjected to further study remains unknown. What is certain is that the case left a scar on the medical consciousness of the era. It became one of those stories never discussed openly, yet never forgotten by those who knew. A cautionary tale passed quietly between professionals, reminding them of the limits of their knowledge. This story is not about sensational horror or grotesque spectacle. It is about a moment when science hesitated, when the pursuit of understanding collided with fear, ethics, and faith. The true unease lies not in what was found within the body, but in what could not be determined with confidence. Because if death cannot be clearly identified, then every declaration becomes a gamble. Every incision carries moral weight. Every autopsy becomes an act of faith rather than certainty. In Florence, in 1763, one body exposed the fragility of that faith. The examination lingered not because the physicians were cruel or careless, but because they were trapped between responsibility and doubt. The autopsy refused to end because no one in that room was ready to accept what its conclusion might imply. And centuries later, as modern medicine continues to debate the precise moment when life ends, that hesitation still echoes, quiet, unresolved, and deeply unsettling. Florence in the year 1763 was a city suspended between two worlds. On the surface, it presented itself as a monument to human achievement. Marble facades glowing in the Tuscan sun, grand churches filled with commissioned masterpieces, libraries stacked with the intellectual spoils of centuries. Travelers spoke of Florence as a place where art, science, and philosophy had once reshaped Europe. But beneath that polished exterior lay a city deeply haunted by death, fear, and contradiction. Progress had not erased superstition, it had merely learned to coexist with it. The Enlightenment had reached Florence, but unevenly. New ideas about anatomy, observation, and empirical study circulated among scholars and physicians, yet these ideas existed under constant scrutiny. The Catholic Church remained the ultimate authority over life, death, and the human body. While dissection was tolerated for educational purposes, it was never fully accepted. The dead were not simply biological remains, they were vessels that had once housed souls, and mishandling them was believed to carry spiritual consequences. Every incision carried not only scientific intent but theological risk. Hospitals in Florence were places of paradox. They served as centers of care and charity, but also as quiet thresholds between life and death. Long stone wards were filled with the sick, the poor, and the forgotten. Mortality was high, and death was common, yet it was rarely spoken of directly. Physicians worked with limited tools and incomplete knowledge, relying on observation, tradition, and experience rather than certainty. Disease often went unnamed. Causes of death were inferred rather than proven. Medicine was as much interpretation as it was science. Anatomical study occupied an uneasy position within this system. Anatomy theaters existed, but access was restricted. Cadavers were scarce, often sourced from executed criminals, unclaimed bodies, or those whose families lacked the power to object. Even then, dissections were conducted quickly and discreetly. Prolonged examination increased the risk of public outrage, religious intervention, or accusations of desecration. The body was meant to be opened, studied, and closed again with minimal attention drawn to the act itself. Florence's physicians were acutely aware of this balance. Many were educated men, familiar with the works of Vesalius and other pioneers who had challenged centuries of anatomical misunderstanding. They believed in progress, but they also understood the limits imposed upon them. To push too far, too visibly, was to invite consequences that could end careers, or worse. Science advanced cautiously here, step by step, always glancing over its shoulder. Death itself was a source of widespread anxiety in 18th century Florence. Epidemics were not distant memories but recent scars. Plague, smallpox, and fevers had swept through the city repeatedly, leaving mass graves and collective trauma in their wake. The boundary between the living and the dead felt thin, permeable. Bells rang frequently for funerals. Black-clad processions wound through narrow streets. Death was ever present, yet deeply feared. Compounding this fear was the persistent uncertainty surrounding the moment of death. Without reliable diagnostic tools, mistakes were inevitable. Stories of premature burial circulated in pamphlets and whispered conversations. Some were exaggerated folklore, others disturbingly credible. Coffins fitted with bells, flags, or breathing tubes began appearing across Europe, physical evidence of a shared terror, the fear of being buried alive. Florence was not immune to this paranoia. It lingered beneath polite society, shaping how death was discussed or avoided. Within this cultural climate, the act of performing an autopsy was never neutral. It was not simply a medical procedure, it was a statement. To open a body was to assert that knowledge could be extracted from flesh, that observation could triumph over mystery. But it also risked revealing uncomfortable truths about the fragility of life, the imprecision of medicine, and the limits of human understanding. Each autopsy carried the potential to destabilize accepted beliefs. Religious doctrine offered certainty where medicine could not. Death, according to theology, occurred when the soul departed the body. This departure was instantaneous, decisive, and ordained by God. To suggest otherwise, to imply that death could be gradual, ambiguous, or reversible, was to challenge the foundation of spiritual authority. For this reason, physicians were careful not to frame their findings in ways that contradicted doctrine. Ambiguity was tolerated only so long as it remained unspoken. Florence's intellectual elite lived with this tension daily. Philosophers debated the nature of life in salons and academies, while priests delivered sermons emphasizing divine order and moral certainty. Physicians stood uncomfortably between these worlds, tasked with treating bodies while respecting souls. Their authority depended on public trust, and that trust was fragile. A single scandal could undo years of careful reputation building. The city itself reinforced this atmosphere. Narrow streets limited visibility. Buildings leaned inward, creating shadows that lingered even at midday. Sound carried strangely through stone corridors, making whispers feel amplified and secrets hard to contain. Privacy was scarce. Rumors spread quickly. A prolonged or unusual autopsy would not remain hidden for long, no matter how discreet its practitioners attempted to be. This was the Florence in which the infamous autopsy took place. Not a city eager for radical truths, but one cautiously navigating the boundary between tradition and transformation. A city proud of its intellectual heritage, yet deeply fearful of destabilization. In such an environment, any medical case that defied explanation was more than a scientific challenge, it was a social threat. When an autopsy extended beyond expectation, it signaled that something had gone wrong. Either the body resisted understanding, or the physicians had misjudged the moment of death itself. Both possibilities were unsettling. One implied ignorance. The other implied guilt. Neither could be comfortably acknowledged in a society that demanded authority from its experts. Thus, the setting matters as much as the body. Florence in 1763 was not prepared for uncertainty. It tolerated inquiry only within carefully maintained boundaries. The city's beauty masked a deep fear of disorder, spiritual, social, and scientific. An autopsy that refused to end did not merely disrupt medical routine, it threatened to expose the fragile assumptions upon which the entire system rested. In this city, silence was often safer than truth. And when knowledge became dangerous, it was easier to bury it, along with the body that inspired it, than to allow its implications to surface. Very little is known with certainty about the person whose body became the center of this prolonged examination, and that absence of clarity is not accidental. In the surviving records, the individual is never fully named. Titles appear where names should be. Descriptions replace identities. It is as if the body was deliberately separated from the life that once inhabited it, stripped of personal history to reduce the risk of consequence. In a society where reputation and lineage mattered deeply, anonymity was protection, not for the dead, but for the living. What can be inferred, however, is telling. This was not the body of a common criminal discarded without ceremony. Nor does it appear to have been a destitute pauper whose death would have gone unnoticed. The care taken, the duration of the examination, and the involvement of senior physicians all suggest a person of some significance. Perhaps not nobility, but someone whose social standing granted their body value in death, educational value, scientific value, and potentially political risk. The condition of the body at the time of examination further complicates the picture. Notes describe careful preparation, suggesting the death was anticipated rather than sudden. This was not a battlefield casualty or a plague victim hastily delivered to a dissection table. The individual appears to have died under medical supervision, likely within a hospital or private residence where physicians were present. That detail alone raises uncomfortable possibilities. If doctors were involved before death, then any uncertainty afterward reflected directly on their judgment. Illness is mentioned repeatedly, though never conclusively identified. Symptoms are referenced obliquely: periods of weakness, altered breathing, prolonged unresponsiveness. Such descriptions were common in cases of fever, neurological disorders, or conditions now understood as inducing comas or cataleptic states. In the 18th century, however, these distinctions were poorly understood. A patient who stopped responding could easily be mistaken for dead, especially if breathing became shallow and irregular. Family presence, if it existed, is conspicuously absent from the records. This omission is striking. Death in Florence was typically a communal affair, witnessed and ritualized. The absence of familial testimony suggests either deliberate exclusion or social circumstances that made such involvement inconvenient. Perhaps the family consented to medical authority without question. Or perhaps they were quietly discouraged from asking too much. In either case, the body became the property of medicine remarkably quickly. As the examination progressed, the language used to describe the subject began to change. Early notes refer to the deceased with confidence. Later entries grow more cautious. Terms soften. Certainty erodes. The body becomes less an object and more a problem, something to be managed rather than understood. This linguistic shift reflects an internal struggle among the physicians, the growing suspicion that their initial declaration of death may have been premature. There are hints, subtle but persistent, that the subject's condition prior to death had already troubled those involved. References to delayed reactions, unusual physical resilience, and inconsistent vital signs appear scattered throughout the documentation. None are emphasized. None are framed as alarming. Yet taken together, they suggest that this was never a straightforward case. The body carried its ambiguity into death, refusing to resolve neatly into certainty. Social status played a critical role in how this ambiguity was handled. Had the subject been a poor laborer or an unclaimed corpse, the autopsy might have been shorter, less careful, and more decisive. But status demanded caution. Mistakes involving the bodies of the socially visible carried consequences. A prolonged autopsy, while unusual, allowed physicians time to be certain, or at least to appear so. It also allowed them to quietly correct assumptions without public scrutiny. Secrecy became a form of control. Access to the body was limited. Fewer assistants were permitted to observe. Discussions moved away from open spaces into private rooms. What began as a medical procedure slowly transformed into a guarded operation. The body was no longer simply being examined, it was being contained. Contained from rumor. Contained from interpretation. Contained from becoming a symbol of medical failure. The subject's physical features are described in neutral, almost detached terms. There is no attempt to humanize. No mention of expression, posture, or personal markers beyond what was medically relevant. This emotional distance was not accidental. To acknowledge the humanity of the body would have made the ethical implications unbearable. Detachment allowed the physicians to continue without confronting the possibility that they were dissecting someone who had not fully crossed the threshold of death. As days passed, the body's resistance to categorization became more pronounced. Decomposition did not follow expected timelines. Certain tissues retained firmness longer than anticipated. Other areas displayed changes that contradicted standard progression. These inconsistencies forced repeated reassessment, pulling the physicians deeper into uncertainty. Each new observation undermined the previous one, erasing the comfort of linear understanding. The subject's identity, once a life lived among others, was now reduced to a question mark. Who they were mattered less than what they represented. They became a case study, a cautionary example, a silent participant in a debate that extended far beyond the autopsy table. Their body was no longer private. It was a site of conflict between knowledge and doubt. What is perhaps most unsettling is the absence of closure. There is no definitive statement declaring the subject conclusively dead before the autopsy began. Nor is there any acknowledgement of error. The records do not admit guilt, nor do they claim vindication. They simply stop. The narrative dissolves into silence, leaving behind fragments that suggest discomfort rather than resolution. This silence speaks volumes. It suggests that the physicians involved understood the implications of what they were confronting and chose discretion over disclosure. The subject's identity was allowed to fade, protecting reputations and institutions at the cost of historical clarity. In doing so, the individual was denied not only a name, but a definitive place in the boundary between life and death. The body at the center of this case was not remembered because of who they were, but because of what they forced others to confront. Their legacy is not written in biography, but in hesitation, in crossed-out notes, in missing pages, in the unspoken fear that medicine, despite its confidence, had acted too soon. In the end, the subject remained suspended between identities, neither fully alive nor conclusively dead in the historical record. Their body became a mirror reflecting the limitations of 18th century medicine and the uncomfortable truth that certainty, especially in matters of death, was often an illusion maintained for the sake of order. And it is within that illusion that this autopsy found itself unable to end. By the time the body was formally placed on the examination table, the physicians involved were already carrying the weight of expectation. This was no longer merely a matter of confirming death. It was an opportunity to extract answers from a body that had unsettled them even in its final hours. The initial atmosphere was clinical, restrained, and outwardly confident. Instruments were arranged with precision. Candles were positioned to minimize shadow. Notes were prepared in advance, their empty pages waiting to be filled with certainty. Yet beneath this carefully constructed order lay an unspoken tension, the kind that emerges when professionals sense they are standing at the edge of something they do not fully understand. The first incisions were made according to established protocol. Skin was parted, muscle exposed, and the body opened with the practiced efficiency expected of trained anatomists. These early stages revealed nothing extraordinary, and for a brief moment, the physicians likely felt reassured. Familiarity breeds comfort, and the body initially seemed willing to conform to what was known. But that sense of control did not last long. As the examination progressed deeper, small irregularities began to surface, details subtle enough to be dismissed individually, yet impossible to ignore collectively. Organs appeared intact in ways that defied expectation. Certain tissues retained color and firmness inconsistent with the presumed time of death. Fluids were present where they should have diminished. These were not signs of vitality in the dramatic sense, but they were signs of delayed transition. The body had not surrendered fully to decay. In an era when post-mortem timelines were central to determining cause and manner of death, such inconsistencies carried serious implications. The physicians paused more frequently as the examination continued. Measurements were repeated. Observations were cross-checked against memory and text rather than relying solely on immediate perception. It was at this point that professional confidence began to fracture. The body was no longer simply being examined, it was resisting interpretation. Each organ raised questions that no existing framework could comfortably answer. As uncertainty crept in, so did caution. The tone of the room shifted. Where there had once been quiet efficiency, there was now deliberate slowness. Assistants waited for instructions rather than anticipating them. The physicians conferred in low voices, careful to keep their doubts contained within the room. This was not fear of the body itself, but fear of what their findings might imply if spoken aloud. In 18th century medicine, authority rested on the ability to declare outcomes with confidence. To hesitate was to expose vulnerability. And yet, hesitation was unavoidable here. The body refused to align neatly with expectation, forcing the physicians into an uncomfortable position, either accept uncertainty or force conclusions where none were justified. Neither option was appealing. Uncertainty threatened reputation. False certainty threatened conscience. At several points, The examination was halted altogether. Tools were set aside. Notes were reviewed. Previous observations were reconsidered in light of new findings. These interruptions were unusual and telling. Autopsies were designed to move forward, not backward. Revisiting earlier stages implied that the foundational assumption, death itself, was under question. The idea that the subject might not have been fully dead at the time of the initial incision lingered like a shadow. It was never articulated directly, but it influenced every decision that followed. The physicians became acutely aware of their own actions, replaying earlier moments in their minds. Had they misread the signs? Had they trusted stillness too easily? These questions had no comforting answers. Ethical considerations, rarely discussed openly in this era, began to surface indirectly. The body was treated with increasing care, not out of reverence, but out of apprehension. Incisions became smaller. Handling grew more cautious. It was as though the physicians were trying to retroactively impose restraint on an act already committed. This subtle shift revealed an internal reckoning. Even without certainty, they sensed that something irreversible might have occurred too soon. As hours stretched into days, preservation methods were employed to slow decay and allow further observation. These measures were unusual for routine autopsies and signaled the gravity of the situation. The body was no longer a subject of a single examination, but of ongoing surveillance. Each day offered the hope that clarity would emerge, that decomposition would finally confirm death beyond doubt. And each day that hope was deferred. The longer the body remained under examination, the more it became a liability. Rumors, even unspoken ones, have a way of forming in closed environments. The physicians understood that if word spread of an autopsy that could not be concluded, questions would follow. Questions they were not prepared to answer publicly. Control over information became as important as control over the body itself. Records from this period reveal a growing reluctance to commit to definitive language. Descriptions grew technical but vague, focusing on structure rather than interpretation. Conclusions were deferred. Statements were qualified. This was not the language of discovery, but of containment. The physicians were documenting without declaring, recording without resolving. At some point, the autopsy ceased to be about understanding the cause of death at all. It became about managing uncertainty and minimizing damage. The body had transformed from a source of knowledge into a source of risk. Every additional incision carried the possibility of further contradiction. Every new observation threatened to destabilize what little certainty remained. The emotional toll on those involved, though never explicitly recorded, is evident in the procedural irregularities. Extended pauses. Revisions. Missing entries. These are the fingerprints of discomfort. They suggest a group of professionals grappling not only with a challenging case, but with the realization that their tools, both physical and conceptual, were insufficient. In the end, the examination did not conclude with resolution, but with quiet withdrawal. The body was not triumphantly understood, nor was it openly acknowledged as a mistake. It was simply allowed to fade from active inquiry, its unresolved nature sealed within incomplete records. The physicians moved on, carrying with them the unspoken weight of what they had encountered. This stage of the autopsy marks the moment when confidence gave way to caution, and curiosity to restraint. It reveals how easily the pursuit of knowledge can collide with ethical uncertainty, and how institutions respond when that collision threatens their foundations. The body on the table had forced its observers to confront the possibility that their authority was built on fragile assumptions. And in that confrontation, the autopsy lost its original purpose. It no longer sought answers. It sought escape, from doubt, from blame, from the terrifying possibility that death itself had been misunderstood. The moment the physicians began what was intended to be the decisive phase of the examination, the atmosphere in the room changed in a way that none of them could fully articulate. This was meant to be the point where uncertainty gave way to confirmation, where the final signs of death would be documented and the case closed with professional authority. Instead, it became the point at which doubt embedded itself so deeply that it could no longer be ignored. They focused first on the organs most closely associated with life itself. The chest cavity was opened further, ribs carefully separated to expose the heart and lungs. In accepted medical understanding of the time, these organs were the arbiters of death. If the heart had ceased entirely and the lungs showed no capacity for breath, the matter was considered settled. Yet what they encountered did not offer the reassurance they expected. The heart was still. That much was clear. but its surrounding tissues did not display the level of collapse or discoloration typically associated with prolonged cessation. The vessels retained an elasticity that felt unsettling beneath the fingers of the examiners. Attention turned to the lungs. They were examined for signs of fluid, collapse, or decay. The findings were ambiguous. There was evidence of distress, but not in a pattern that allowed for confident interpretation. The lungs did not tell a clear story of suffocation, infection, or failure. Instead, they seemed suspended between explanations, as though the body had been interrupted mid-process rather than reaching a natural endpoint. At this stage, the physicians might normally have moved forward decisively, attributing anomalies to variation or error. But the accumulation of inconsistencies made such dismissal increasingly difficult. They began to compare this body not only to textbook descriptions, but to others they had examined personally. Memory became a secondary diagnostic tool, and it offered no comfort. This body did not behave like the others. As they continued, the nervous system drew particular attention. The spinal cord and surrounding structures were observed with unusual care. In the 18th century, understanding of neurological function was rudimentary, but physicians were aware that certain conditions could induce profound unresponsiveness without immediate death. Catalepsy, apoplexy, and other poorly defined states lingered at the edges of medical awareness. These conditions were rare, frightening, and often confused with death itself. What unsettled the physicians most was not a single definitive sign, but the absence of finality. The body did not present the clear markers that would have allowed them to move forward without hesitation. There were no unmistakable indicators that all vital processes had ceased irrevocably before the first incision was made. The possibility that some residual function might have persisted, however faint, became increasingly difficult to dismiss. This realization introduced a new layer of fear into the examination. The physicians were no longer just observers. They were participants in a sequence of actions whose moral weight was shifting. If death had not been complete, then the autopsy itself became an intrusion into the final moments of life rather than an examination of its aftermath. The distinction was subtle, but its implications were enormous. Attempts were made to rationalize the findings. Environmental factors were considered. Temperature, preservation techniques, and individual constitution were all invoked as possible explanations. Florence's climate, though temperate, could slow certain aspects of decay. A robust physique might retain tissue integrity longer than expected. These explanations were not unreasonable, but they felt insufficient. Each offered partial reassurance, yet none fully accounted for the pattern emerging on the table. As doubt intensified, so did the impulse to verify. Previously examined areas were revisited. Organs were inspected again, this time with a heightened awareness of what was at stake. The physicians were not merely checking their work, they were searching for permission to conclude. They needed something unequivocal, something that would allow them to say, with confidence, that death had preceded their actions. But the body refused to grant that permission. The longer they looked, the more they noticed details they wished they had not seen. Subtle variations in tissue response. The way certain structures resisted manipulation. The unsettling neutrality of the body itself, offering neither confirmation nor contradiction, only ambiguity. This ambiguity was more disturbing than any grotesque anomaly could have been. It eroded the foundation of their authority, replacing it with a quiet, persistent unease. The idea of stopping crossed their minds more than once. To halt the examination and declare the findings inconclusive would have been an act of honesty, but also one of vulnerability. Such an admission could invite scrutiny from peers, religious authorities, and civic leaders. It could raise questions about competence, judgment, and moral responsibility. In a profession built on trust, uncertainty was dangerous currency. So they continued, even as their confidence waned. Their notes from this phase reveal a noticeable shift in tone. Descriptions become cautious, almost defensive. Words like appears, suggests, and may indicate replace declarative statements. Conclusions are deferred. The language reflects minds grappling with possibilities they are unwilling to confront directly. This was no longer a record of discovery. It was a record of hesitation. As hours passed, exhaustion compounded the strain. Candlelight flickered lower. The smell of preservatives mixed with fatigue. Physical discomfort mirrored mental unrest. Decisions that might have been straightforward earlier now felt burdened with consequence. Every action was weighed, reconsidered, and often delayed. The examination slowed to a near standstill, not because there was nothing left to observe, but because observation itself had become fraught. At some point, the question shifted internally from what caused death to when did death truly occur. This was a far more dangerous question. It challenged not only the specifics of this case, but the broader assumptions upon which medical practice relied. If death could not be reliably identified, then every diagnosis, every certification, every burial carried potential error. The physicians did not voice this question aloud. To do so would have been to acknowledge the fragility of their discipline. Instead, it lingered unspoken, shaping their actions and their silence. The autopsy continued not out of curiosity, but out of necessity, a desperate search for certainty that never arrived. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the examination had crossed a threshold. It was no longer progressing toward resolution. It was circling an absence, unable to move forward or retreat. The body had exposed a gap in understanding that could not be closed with tools or texts. This was the moment when the autopsy ceased to function as a means of explanation and became something else entirely, a confrontation with the limits of knowledge. The physicians were left with observations they could not comfortably interpret and implications they could not safely acknowledge. The body remained on the table, opened but unresolved, its silence heavier than any verdict. And in that silence, the fear took root that whatever lines separated life from death, they had approached it too closely, without knowing exactly where it lay. What followed was not a continuation of a medical procedure, but a slow descent into something far more unsettling. The autopsy, which by all established norms should have concluded within hours, stretched into days, then beyond. Each decision to continue was justified as caution, as thoroughness, as responsibility. In reality, it was fear of stopping too soon, fear of admitting uncertainty, fear of what silence might imply if the body were finally closed and buried without answers. Preservation became essential. Measures were taken to delay decay, methods that were known but rarely applied for such extended observation. The body was treated not as something finished, but as something suspended. Time itself was being held at bay in the hope that clarity would eventually assert itself. The physicians watched for changes, not out of curiosity, but out of desperation. They needed the body to behave like a corpse in a way that could no longer be questioned. Each day brought renewed examination. The same organs were inspected again and again, not because new techniques were available, but because repetition felt safer than conclusion. What had once been documented with confidence was now re-evaluated with caution. Earlier notes were compared against present observations, discrepancies highlighted and then quietly set aside when they led nowhere. The body became a paradox, unchanged enough to provoke suspicion, altered enough to resist certainty. The physicians did not all agree on how to proceed. Subtle divisions emerged, though they were never formally acknowledged. Some believed the inconsistencies could still be explained within known frameworks, individual variation, environmental conditions, errors in initial assessment. Others were less convinced. They sensed that something more fundamental was at play, something that existing knowledge could not fully contain. These disagreements were expressed obliquely, through tone, hesitation, and the careful phrasing of notes rather than open debate. To openly challenge the legitimacy of the initial death declaration would have been unthinkable. Such an admission would implicate not only individual physicians, but the credibility of medical authority as a whole. And so the conflict remained internal, unresolved, festering beneath professional courtesy. The autopsy continued not because consensus had been reached, but because no one was willing to take responsibility for ending it. The room itself began to feel altered by this prolonged vigil. What had once been a place of controlled procedure took on the atmosphere of confinement. The body dominated the space, its presence growing heavier with each passing day. Assistants rotated in and out, some relieved of duty without explanation, others instructed to observe but not speak. The fewer people involved, the easier it became to manage information and fear. As time stretched on, the physician's relationship with the body changed. It was no longer an object of study in the traditional sense. It became a reminder, a provocation. Every glance invited the same unanswerable question. Had they crossed a boundary unknowingly? Had their pursuit of knowledge outpaced their understanding? The body offered no absolution, only continued ambiguity. Attempts were made to reinterpret earlier findings in light of the ongoing preservation. Perhaps the delayed decomposition was an artifact of the methods employed. Perhaps the anomalies were exaggerated by expectation rather than evidence. These rationalizations provided temporary relief, but they never lasted. Too many details resisted assimilation into comforting narratives. The pattern remained fractured, unresolved. The documentation from this period reflects the strain. Entries become irregular. Dates are noted inconsistently. Observations are recorded without interpretation, as though meaning itself had become too dangerous to assign. In some places, handwriting changes abruptly, suggesting different authors stepping in at different moments, possibly to distribute responsibility, possibly to dilute accountability. The record becomes less a story and more a collage of cautious fragments. Outside the examination room, pressure mounted quietly. Even without explicit rumors, prolonged activity could not remain entirely unnoticed. Supplies were requisitioned. Schedules disrupted. Questions asked indirectly. The physicians became increasingly aware that the longer the autopsy continued, the greater the risk of attracting unwanted attention. Yet stopping now, without resolution, felt equally perilous. The body itself remained stubbornly neutral. It did not offer the dramatic confirmation they sought. No sudden acceleration of decay. No unmistakable signs that would allow them to close the case with confidence. Instead, it lingered in a state that felt almost intentional, as though resisting categorization. This perception, though irrational, took root in the exhausted minds of those observing it. The body began to feel less passive, not because it acted, but because it refused to conform. At some point, the goal subtly shifted. The physicians were no longer trying to understand what had happened to the subject. They were trying to protect themselves from the implications of what might have happened. The autopsy became an exercise in containment rather than discovery. Information was managed. Language softened. Conclusions deferred indefinitely. There were moments when continuation seemed absurd, when fatigue and frustration threatened to overwhelm restraint. In those moments, the possibility of ending the examination resurfaced, only to be dismissed again. What if the very next observation would have provided the clarity they needed? What if stopping now meant forfeiting the chance to correct a catastrophic mistake? These questions, though unspoken, drove the process forward long after logic suggested it should have ended. The longer the autopsy persisted, the more it deviated from any recognizable protocol. What remained was a liminal practice, neither routine nor experimental, guided more by anxiety than by method. The physicians were navigating without a map, driven by the hope that certainty might still be recovered if they simply waited long enough. But certainty did not come. Instead, the passage of time only deepened the sense of disquiet. The body's unresolved state became a symbol of their own uncertainty. The autopsy had ceased to be a means to an end. It had become an end in itself, sustained by the fear of what conclusion might reveal. Eventually, the examination began to slow not because questions had been answered, but because the cost of continuation had become too great. Resources dwindled. Attention shifted. The physicians grew quieter, more withdrawn. The body remained, but the urgency faded into resignation. The autopsy did not end with a declaration or a final note. It simply lost momentum, slipping into silence without resolution. What remained was not knowledge, but unease. A case that had gone on too long, asked too much, and answered too little. The autopsy refused to end because it had exposed something the physicians were not prepared to face, that their understanding of death was provisional, fragile, and deeply uncertain. And once that realization took hold, there was no conclusion that could feel safe enough to record. When the physical examination could no longer be justified by progress or hope of resolution, attention shifted quietly from the body to the paper trail it was leaving behind. In the world of 18th century medicine, records were meant to be authoritative. They transformed observation into fact, uncertainty into conclusion. But in this case, the written record became something else entirely, a battleground where knowledge, fear, and self-preservation collided. At first, the documentation followed convention. Observations were dated, measurements recorded, anatomical descriptions laid out in precise, almost ritualistic language. The early pages carry a tone of confidence, even routine professionalism. Yet as the autopsy stretched beyond expectation, that tone fractured. Sentences grew longer, more cautious. Conclusions were delayed. Words that once asserted now merely suggested. This shift did not occur suddenly, but it is unmistakable in hindsight. Certain pages show evidence of revision. Inco verwritten. Margins crowded with additions that attempt to soften or reinterpret earlier claims. In some places, entire paragraphs appear to have been deliberately removed, leaving behind gaps that disrupt continuity. These absences are not random. They cluster around the moments where doubt seems to have been strongest, where observations could not be reconciled with accepted definitions of death. The most striking feature of the surviving material is what it refuses to say. There is no explicit acknowledgement of error, no admission that death may have been misdiagnosed. Instead, the language circles the issue, orbiting uncertainty without naming it. This was not accidental. To record such doubt would have been to create a permanent confession, one that could outlive its authors and invite scrutiny long after the body itself was gone. Medical records in Florence were not private documents in the modern sense. They could be reviewed by institutions, referenced by peers, and, in certain circumstances, accessed by religious authorities. Every word carried potential consequence. The physicians understood this well. What they wrote mattered not only scientifically, but socially and spiritually. A single poorly phrased sentence could undermine years of careful professional standing. As awareness of this risk grew, so did caution. Documentation became selective. Details that raised uncomfortable questions were minimized or framed ambiguously. Where specificity might invite interpretation, vagueness offered protection. This was not deception in the crude sense, but strategic omission. A way of allowing the record to exist without revealing its most destabilizing implications. Some notes appear to have been written by different hands at different times, suggesting collaboration, or perhaps diffusion of responsibility. The shift in handwriting and phrasing hints at a collective effort to manage the narrative. No single voice dominates the later entries. Instead, the record fragments, as though unity itself had become dangerous. Shared authorship meant shared accountability, and diluted blame. There are also references to documents that no longer exist. Mentions of prior observations, earlier conclusions, or comparative cases that cannot be found among the surviving pages. These ghost references suggest a deliberate thinning of the archive. Material was not simply lost, it was likely removed. Whether this was done by the physicians themselves, by institutional oversight, or by later custodians remains unclear. What is clear is that the record we have is incomplete by design. The role of religious oversight looms quietly behind these omissions. While the Church did not manage medical records directly, it maintained influence over institutions that housed them. Anything that challenged doctrinal certainty regarding death and the soul posed a risk. An autopsy that raised doubts about when death truly occurred could invite theological inquiry, an outcome no physician wanted. Silence, in this context, was not merely convenient, it was necessary. The surviving language reveals a careful balancing act. On one hand, the physicians needed to justify the extended examination. On the other, they needed to avoid explaining why such justification was necessary. This resulted in a peculiar tone, meticulous yet evasive. The record documents action without motive, observation without interpretation. It is a chronicle of procedure stripped of meaning. Even the conclusion, or lack thereof, is telling. Where one would expect a final assessment, there is only an abrupt tapering of entries. No closing statement. No definitive cause of death. No summary of findings. The narrative simply dissolves. This absence is more revealing than any explicit admission could have been. It suggests that no conclusion felt safe enough to record. In the culture of the time, unfinished records were not unheard of, but they were unusual in cases of this magnitude. The decision to leave the file unresolved implies discomfort, not oversight. It suggests that those involved preferred ambiguity to the permanence of written certainty. Better to leave questions unanswered than to answer them incorrectly. Over time, the case faded from active memory, but the traces it left behind remained, scattered and fragmented. Later scholars encountering these documents would find them puzzling, incomplete, and frustrating. Without context, the omissions appear as simple gaps. With context, they reveal a deliberate effort to control what could be known. What makes these records truly forbidden is not that they contain shocking revelations, but that they demonstrate restraint born of fear. They show how knowledge can be constrained not by lack of observation, but by the consequences of understanding. The physicians saw enough to unsettle themselves, but not enough, or not safely enough, to declare anything openly. In this way, the records become a mirror of the autopsy itself. Just as the body resisted final categorization, the documentation resisted final interpretation. Both existed in a liminal state, suspended between disclosure and concealment. The truth was neither fully buried nor fully revealed. The disappearance of pages, the cautious language, the unresolved ending, all point to a shared recognition that some discoveries were too destabilizing to preserve intact. Not because they were false, but because they were true in ways that threatened established order. The forbidden nature of these records lies not in what they say, but in what they refuse to say, and in the collective decision to let silence stand where certainty should have been. In the end, the written record did not clarify the autopsy. It absorbed its uncertainty, preserving doubt as carefully as any specimen. And in doing so, it ensured that the case would remain suspended in history, unresolved and unsettling, long after the ink had dried and the body itself had disappeared. Centuries later, when the emotional weight of the case has faded and the institutional fear that once surrounded it has loosened its grip, the lingering question remains whether what troubled those Florentine physicians was truly extraordinary or simply misunderstood. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to view the prolonged autopsy as an overreaction born of superstition and limited knowledge. Yet when examined carefully, the medical ambiguities they faced appear far less irrational than they might first seem. Modern medicine now recognizes a wide range of physiological states that blur the boundary between life and death. Conditions such as catalepsy, severe hypothermia, metabolic disorders, and certain neurological syndromes can produce profound unresponsiveness, slowed respiration, and faint or undetectable pulses. In the 18th century, these states were poorly understood and often lumped together under vague diagnoses. A patient could appear entirely lifeless while still retaining minimal biological function that would not announce itself in obvious ways. Catalepsy, in particular, deserves attention. Documented as early as antiquity, it is characterized by muscular rigidity, diminished responsiveness, and extremely shallow breathing. To an 18th century physician relying on touch, sight, and crude observation, a cataleptic individual could easily be mistaken for dead. If death were declared during such a state, the body's resistance to immediate decomposition would later appear unsettling, even supernatural. Another possibility lies in what modern science refers to as delayed cellular death. Even after cardiac arrest, cells and tissues do not die simultaneously. Some organs, particularly the brain and certain muscle tissues, undergo gradual degradation rather than immediate collapse. This staggered shutdown can produce post-mortem phenomena that confuse inexperienced or under-equipped observers. In an era without biochemical testing, such nuances would have been deeply troubling. Environmental factors also matter. Florence's climate, storage conditions, and the use of early preservation techniques could all slow visible decomposition. Temperature fluctuations, humidity, and airflow influence how quickly a body displays unmistakable signs of death. A well-nourished individual with a strong constitution might resist decay longer than expected, further complicating attempts to establish a clear timeline. There is also the question of post-mortem reflexes. Even today, involuntary muscle contractions and gas-induced movements can occur after death. In the 18th century, such phenomena were poorly understood and often interpreted as signs of lingering vitality. A body that appeared to resist handling or manipulation could easily provoke fear, even if no true life remained. Taken together, these factors suggest that the Florentine physicians were confronting not a supernatural anomaly, but the limits of their diagnostic framework. They lacked the tools to definitively determine when life had ended, and they were operating in a cultural environment that demanded certainty. When that certainty proved elusive, anxiety filled the gap. Yet acknowledging these explanations does not diminish the ethical weight of the case. If anything, it amplifies it. The physicians were not foolish or hysterical. They were responding rationally to evidence they could not reconcile. Their fear was not of ghosts or undead corpses, but of professional and moral failure. The possibility that their actions had crossed a boundary prematurely haunted them because it was plausible. From a modern standpoint, the most striking aspect of the case is how familiar it feels. Contemporary debates about brain death, life support, and end-of-life care echo the same uncertainty. Advances in technology have refined our definitions, but they have not eliminated ambiguity. Patients declared brain dead can retain cardiac function. Life can be sustained artificially long after consciousness has irreversibly vanished. The line between living body and dead person remains contested. In this light, the Florentine autopsy appears less like a medical horror story and more like an early confrontation with questions that still trouble us. The physicians lacked ventilators, electroencephalograms, and standardized criteria, but they were grappling with the same fundamental problem: how to define death in a way that is both scientifically sound and ethically acceptable. It is also worth considering the psychological toll of prolonged exposure to uncertainty. Modern research shows that decision-making deteriorates under sustained ambiguity and stress. The longer the autopsy continued, the more the physician's perceptions would have been influenced by expectation and fatigue. Every anomaly would feel magnified. Every delay would reinforce the sense that something was wrong. In such conditions, doubt feeds on itself. This does not mean their observations were imagined. It means they were filtered through a context that amplified their significance. A body that resisted easy classification became a symbol of everything medicine could not yet explain. The autopsy transformed from a technical procedure into an existential dilemma. The temptation to dismiss the case as a product of primitive science misses this deeper truth. The physicians were not merely misreading signs. They were encountering the uncomfortable reality that death is not always clear-cut. Their mistake, if it can be called one, was assuming that it should be. Modern medicine has learned to live with this ambiguity, albeit uneasily. Protocols exist, but they are continually revised. Ethical committees debate cases that defy categorization. Families struggle to accept definitions that feel abstract or counterintuitive. Despite centuries of progress, the moment when life ends remains one of the most contested boundaries in science. Seen through this lens, the Florentine case is not an outlier but a precursor. It represents an early recognition that death is not a single event, but a process, a transition that unfolds over time and varies from body to body. The physicians sensed this intuitively, even if they lack the language to articulate it. What makes the case unsettling is not that they encountered something inexplicable, but that they encountered something explainable only by admitting uncertainty. In a culture that demanded authority, such admission was unacceptable. And so the autopsy lingered, suspended between action and acknowledgement. The question of whether the case reflects medical horror or misunderstood science ultimately misses the point. It was both. It was horrifying precisely because it revealed how limited understanding could produce irreversible consequences. It was misunderstood because the tools needed to interpret it properly did not yet exist. In the end, the body did not expose a hidden monster or supernatural force. It exposed a gap between observation and interpretation, between certainty and truth. That gap remains with us, even now. The Florentine physicians stood at its edge, uncomfortable and unprepared, and chose hesitation over declaration. Their prolonged autopsy was not a failure of science, but an early warning that science, no matter how advanced, will always encounter moments where clarity dissolves into doubt. And perhaps that is the most unsettling conclusion of all. Beyond the walls of the Florentine autopsy chamber, the ripples of fear and speculation spread quietly but persistently through the city. Although the general public likely remained unaware of the specifics of this particular examination, the cultural milieu of 18th century Florence was already saturated with anxieties about death, the afterlife, and the fragile boundary between life and the lifeless. Tales of bodies mistakenly declared dead, of coffins disturbed by the desperate hands of those not yet gone, were whispered in markets, taverns, and churches alike. These stories fed into a broader folklore, one where death was not simply a moment but a state that could linger, recede, or even return in unsettling ways. Public imagination at the time was deeply influenced by these accounts. The fear of being buried alive, taphophobia, was not just a curiosity, but a genuine social concern. Coffins were occasionally constructed with bells, cords, or ventilation mechanisms designed to signal life after burial. Families agonized over the proper verification of death. Physicians and midwives were expected to exercise extreme caution before certifying that a person had passed. In Florence, as elsewhere in Europe, the uncertainty surrounding the exact moment of death was a source of persistent dread, and any case that appeared ambiguous reinforced these anxieties. Folklore and superstition often intertwined with practical concerns. Stories of revenants, restless spirits, and the so-called living dead circulated alongside medical observations. A corpse that displayed unexpected resistance to decay, or a body that remained unusually firm or responsive, could be interpreted as a sign of spiritual unrest rather than a biological anomaly. In the absence of reliable scientific explanation, fear filled the vacuum left by ignorance. The Florentine autopsy, though conducted in secrecy, echoed these fears and contributed, even indirectly, to the cultural obsession with ensuring that death had truly occurred. Physicians themselves were aware of the social stakes. An autopsy that defied expectation was not merely a professional challenge, it was a potential scandal. If the public learned that medical authority could misidentify death, trust would erode. Patients might refuse treatment. Families might challenge physicians in ways that could carry legal, social, or ecclesiastical consequences. The delicate equilibrium between expertise and authority relied on certainty, and the Florentine case disrupted that equilibrium at a fundamental level. This tension extended beyond medicine into the broader cultural imagination. Artists, writers, and clergy often reflected contemporary fears of premature death and post-mortem disturbance. Sermons would caution against moral failings that might lead to an unsettled spirit. Literature explored the terror of awakening in a grave, the horror of returning to the world when the living had already moved on. The anxieties raised by ambiguous deaths resonated with these broader narratives, amplifying both fascination and dread. Stories of bodies that refused to die became part of a moral and philosophical discourse about life, the soul, and human frailty. Even within scientific circles, the Florentine case would have served as a cautionary tale. The uncertainty surrounding the body challenged assumptions about observation and diagnosis, and it exposed gaps in the prevailing understanding of human physiology. Physicians and anatomists would have shared this knowledge discreetly, recognizing the fine line between professional discussion and public alarm. The fear of misidentifying death was no longer theoretical. It was now something tangible, a reminder that the limits of medical knowledge had real-world consequences. Religious institutions also engaged with these fears, though often indirectly. While the Church rarely intervened directly in medical procedures, the moral and theological implications of mistaken death were significant. A misdiagnosis could imply that the soul remained present in the body, that divine judgment had not yet been realized, or that sacred rites were performed prematurely. Such errors carried spiritual consequences in the eyes of the faithful, reinforcing the perception that the boundary between life and death was fraught not only with biological uncertainty but with moral and metaphysical significance. The broader consequence was a society intensely aware of the fragility of human mortality. Every death was scrutinized, every body treated with ritualistic care, and every medical judgment carried social weight. The Florentine autopsy, with its unresolved nature, contributed to a climate in which the public and professionals alike learned to respect uncertainty. Death was no longer merely a moment to be marked. It became a phenomenon to be observed, verified, and feared. This cultural anxiety also shaped practices surrounding care for the dying. Families took elaborate measures to ensure that those near death were closely monitored. Physicians and attendants were instructed to watch for faint signs of life. Rituals of confirmation, touch, breath checks, and observation over time became commonplace. In some cases, these practices reflected an emerging empirical approach, but they were also deeply entwined with fear. The lessons drawn from ambiguous deaths informed how Florence and similar societies approached both the end of life and the beginning of mourning. Stories about bodies that refused to die became embedded in the moral imagination as well. They served as cautionary tales. The living must be vigilant, the dead must be treated with respect, and certainty is never absolute. In the shadow of such cases, Florence's citizens developed an acute sensitivity to the signs of life and death, a heightened awareness that bordered on obsession. Public and private rituals reflected this tension, blending medical observation with spiritual vigilance. The Florentine autopsy, though largely hidden from the general population, would have echoed in these cultural narratives. Even without knowledge of the case's specifics, the very idea of a prolonged, uncertain examination reinforced fears already circulating in the city. It validated stories of premature burial and restless corpses. It made tangible the abstract dread that death was not always final, that the line between life and lifelessness was sometimes imperceptibly thin. The case did not need publicity to influence society. It resonated through existing anxieties, shaping the collective imagination of a population attuned to mortality and the unknown. In retrospect, the significance of this cultural response is clear. The Florentine autopsy was not simply an isolated medical anomaly. It was part of a broader tapestry of fear, superstition, and inquiry that defined Europe in the 18th century. It highlights how medical uncertainty, even when confined to professional circles, could ripple outward, influencing folklore, literature, religious practice, and social behavior. The body that refused to die became more than a medical curiosity. It became a symbol, a reminder of the fragility of human knowledge and the persistent power of mortality to unsettle the living. In this way, the case bridges the gap between science and society. It shows how professional anxiety and cultural dread are intertwined, each reinforcing the other. The autopsy may have been hidden behind closed doors, but its influence spread silently through rumor, moral discourse, and shared imagination. Florence, like much of Europe at the time, was both fascinated and terrified by the uncertainty of death, and cases such as this one were central to that ongoing engagement with mortality. It is this intersection, between fear, observation, and the human impulse to know, that gives the story its enduring resonance, even centuries later.